Our world, back in the mid-60s, late 60s, early 70s, as baby boomers were going into college, some going to war. We were involved in a war in Southeast Asia into China, and our nation was rocked with civil unrest, sexual revolution, illicit drug use, all kinds of stuff was going on, and yet in the middle of all of that, God's Spirit was moving, and the Jesus generation was born. And hippies were coming to know Christ and were being baptized in the sea and the ocean and rivers, lakes, everywhere, coming into the church, and they were bringing their music with them, and the church music world was never the same since that time. And in the end of that time of the 60s, our little church, just like so many other churches that were concerned about young people, called their first music youth minister in 1968. And as was also kind of typical of that little church, every 2 to 3 years, the pastor and the staff left for whatever reason. And in 1971, a young single guy that just earned his Master of Communication in pre-law came as his first full-time church to our church and became our music and youth minister. Excuse me. And that's when I first met Ron Hill. And Ron served as our music youth minister there for several years while I was away at college, and served as a full-time minister until 1984, and then he took a 2-year vacation and worked for a company where he was over 600 people in an office, small vacation. And they delivered him by calling him to San Antonio, Texas in 1986 to Trinity Baptist Church as a singles minister. And at one time, Trinity Baptist Church, under his leadership, God blessed them, and they were the largest singles ministry in the United States. He also became education minister and singles there before, in 2003, he became the founding pastor of Fellowship Church in Stone Oak. So with great joy, I introduce my friend and my mentor, Ron Hill.
Thank you so much for the pleasure of being here. And I think Charles just told you how old I was. And that's okay. I don't mind. He's not that far behind me. Because when I went to Cleveland, I was just a kid, really. And it was such a pleasure to be there. I was at First Cleveland for 2 years. Got to know Charles Fanning, who I met just a few minutes ago in Tryon Evergreen Association. Yeah, First Cleveland was interesting. They had celebrated while I was there their 100th anniversary, and I noticed they had what they called, the librarian of the church was Wynette Coe, and she got a group of women together to put the pictures of every pastor who had ever served in this long hallway. And it was very interesting to me because math isn't my major, but in 100 years they had 52 pastors. Which means that Cleveland was so good they went off and did other things. But one night in our youth group, it was after Charles went to college, a bunch of us had gone down to Houston and the Baptist bookstore. Wasn't that a fun thing to do? And I bought one of those pictures of Lottie Moon where she looks like she's constipated. And one Thursday night during our Bible study, we went down there, and about the third pastor, we slit a hole in the back of that pastor's picture and put hers in there. And about a week or two later, Miss Coe came up to me, and of course, she was always interesting. She couldn't pronounce library. Even though she was a librarian, she called herself the librarian. And I asked her if she was from Europe, but that didn't help. But nonetheless, she came to my office. I could hear those heels click down the hallway. And she said, "Brother Ron, do you know anything about that picture down there?" And I said, "What picture?" And she said, "Come with me." And I stayed behind her to try to not laugh. And she said, "That one right there." And I said, "Wynette, I never knew that Lottie Moon was a pastor of this church." She was so disgusted, she just left. It was a great time. It was a great time. And from there, I went to the other side of the state for a while, and then eventually to Trinity Baptist for 20 years. That was wonderful. And then started a church. In fact, today is the 18th anniversary of the fellowship. And so they're celebrating, and so am I, by being here. By the way, I gave David one more chance to preach in this pulpit this morning because his trip fell through. And I told him the other day to go ahead and reclaim it, and I'll put my sermon in the deep freeze and use it later. But even this morning, he said, no, you go right ahead. And I have to tell you, I'd probably rather listen to him preach than me anyway. But nonetheless, it reminds me a little bit about that story of the wonderful man who was saved in a flood, and he saved his family barely, and he got saved. And he went around the country, his pastor helped him. He went around the country telling this incredibly wild and difficult story about being saved in the flood. And people loved it everywhere. Every crowded auditoriums, churches, everywhere he went, he told the story. Well, one day he died. He went to heaven. St. Peter said, we've heard the story, and you telling it all over the world. It's wonderful what you have done in telling your story. So we're calling a meeting tonight in heaven for you you're going to be the keynote, and you're going to tell the story. And he says, oh, I'd love to. And St. Peter said, and guess what? Noah's going to be there. So I feel a little bit like that. By the way, this message today, I don't know where the slides are, but it's out of Matthew. You know this story. If you've been around, you know the story very well. It's the story of Jesus walking on the water. It's a story of people being upset. It's a story of consternation. It's a story of being frightened in this world. Have you ever thought of that? Have you ever thought that a pandemic could come and just uproot everything that you held dear? And we all live in that. We live in this incredible age that none of us ever thought we'd be here. I'd only seen this in the movie theater, and it didn't end well. But I'm telling you, if you're like me, even with all the patience that I have, there are moments and times where I'm so frustrated because I want to go somewhere and you can't. When I retired, the church gave me enough money to do some trips and things like that. Well, I can't go. That's frustrating. And I know where I want to go. I know what I want to do. Even at Thanksgiving and Christmas, our big group family that we always have and bring together, we divided up into what I call pods. Every pod got 4 people. And that's how we celebrated. And in a world, and by the way, did you hear we had an election not long ago? Every 4 years. I think they ought to be every 10 years. But it's amazing to me that no matter which side you voted for, it's disruptive. It's difficult. Because in our age, and we helped make it that way, everything is politicized. In my church, I refuse to let anybody talk about politics because politics divides people. It divides families. It divides friends. I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, I've lost my friends, my Christian friends. That's terrible. And then what about diseases and difficulties? I lost my mother to Lou Gehrig's disease, one of the worst diseases in the world. You've lost loved ones. And so we've all had those moments of being in the boat of our life and the waves are moving against it. And here we are trying to navigate life and just be good. Now, next slide and then the next one. There you go. It's all faith. We know, you see, here's the good thing about Baptists and about Christians is we live by faith. At least we say we do. Until it gets rough, and then we get all scattered and scared, and we live in the moment, and sometimes we start looking down at the waves, and we lose our faith so easily. That's what we do. And yet when we come, it's why you need, by the way, to come to church regularly. It's why you need Bible study. It's why you need prayer. It's why you need fellowship with friends. Is because we get re-energized and reprioritized. Buckner used to say, you don't have priorities in life, you have priority. And the priority is Jesus Christ. And as a Christian, you and I have one priority. And out of that priority comes everything else. And then everything makes sense. It just makes sense. And this story is kind of one of those stories that we kind of live by. Next slide. Jesus, you know the backstory to this is Jesus had just fed the 5,000, which by the way was probably more 10, 15,000 people there. They counted the men, and so there were a lot of people. And Jesus is saying, and you know that story, it's one of the great stories told in all the Gospels, and it's a story that was so significant because here's a big crowd that had gathered to hear Jesus, and he's smart enough to know that you better let them eat or they won't listen. Right? Isn't that true? Just wait until noon today. I have a brother-in-law who doesn't listen to anything till after he's eaten. It's just that important. But we're all that way. And we've learned it in our ministries. Feed the people. Feed the people. And then they'll listen to you. I've spoken many times downtown to the homeless shelters. Feed them. Then they'll listen to you. Jesus did that. Except you know what happened in that story? You may want to go back and read it. At the end, John tells us a little more. At the end, they had an argument. One of the greatest events in Christianity, and here are the disciples gathering around Jesus, and I'm sure there were some leaders in that group that were part of the instigation. And you know what they were talking about? They were talking about making Jesus King of Israel. Let's run him for president. Let's get him out there. Let's have a political thing going here. We'll start a political action committee. That's what they were doing. And can you imagine Jesus? You know, I was thinking about the Super Bowl today. These guys spent years in junior high, high school, 4 years there, 4 years in college with great coaches. And then every level, only a few get to go forward. And the best of the best is playing today. And you know what? After all these years, they get to do their position that they've been taught for a decade or more. For a decade or more. And if they make one wrong tackle, one wrong move, they could miss the guy with the ball and he could make a touchdown. Or on the other side, the opposite. Listen, Jesus had 3 years, which is his number, by the way, God's number. He had 3 years. And so here he is standing, feeding of the 5,000, and they're saying, let's go to Jerusalem and put you up in politics. You know what he said? I love it. Get in the boat and go to the other side. And I love that passage. Let's go to the next slide here. He says, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go to the head of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. It's kind of like, oh, for goodness sakes, what do we do? Get in the boat. And notice he didn't go with them. He was disgusted, I think. And he thought, I've got to straighten it out. I don't know about you, but there are times in my life where I have to pull aside and pray and get realigned with Christ. Priority. So he said, get in the boat. So they got in the boat and they're probably talking politics. Oh, think about what I can do the posters. Judas is saying, I'll raise some money. Well, I'll be the treasurer. Okay, let's do that. And so he said, go to the other side. And he said, crowd, go home. Go home. Next slide. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Do you see what he did? Pulled himself aside, said, I don't know how I missed that, but I did. And later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Wind is the only element that you and I cannot control. Rain, umbrella. Cold, coat. Heat, take coat off. But wind is the one that frustrates us the most. Why? Because it whirls and swirls. And so do the disasters of your life. You only get one medical announcement that you don't like, and the wind is blowing against you. You only get one little disease that floats in the air, and all of a sudden people begin to die from it, and the wind is blowing against it. You only get one thing that your husband or wife says, I'm going to leave you, and the wind is blowing against it. A child gets sick. You lose a parent. You lose a spouse. The world is full. If you live long enough, you're going to have the wind against you. And I'm not talking about the wind of the Holy Spirit. I'm talking about the winds of the world, of where things happen that you cannot control. But our reaction, listen to this, you can't control it, but your reaction to it can make all the difference. And I believe that's what Jesus was doing. If you've ever been to Israel, I know about the spot where this happened, and there's a little mountain range over here, right in the Judean hills, and then the Lake Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee, which is a lake. It's a freshwater lake, comes out of 4 springs, and that freshwater lake goes to, I'm guessing they were going toward modern-day Tiberias. But if you're standing up on that mountain, you can see across the lake. If you've been to Lake Buchanan, it's bigger than Lake Buchanan, probably twice as big or more. But you can still see across it. And especially at that place he was. And so there he was praying, and all of a sudden he realized he's looking out there and he sees they're in trouble. Next slide. Then we need to remember, no matter where we are, what we're doing, no matter what happens in life, God is watching over you. He knows your needs. He knows your hurts. He knows your dreams. He knows all that you are. He knows all that you desire. And that's why we need to come back to that incredible personhood of Jesus Christ. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. Do we forget that? Do we need to be reminded of that? Next slide. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. Now, I think that's important because look at this. Jesus was he was trying to get to them as fast as he could. So why not? He created the lake. He created the water. He created the wind and the atmosphere and the rains and the seas and the land. So he's just walking across the lake. But I love the disciples' reaction. They were terrified. It's a ghost. It's a ghost. You see, they weren't looking for Jesus. They weren't looking for Jesus. They were looking out for themselves, and it was scary. They thought they were going to have a shipwreck. And believe me, I've been out on that lake. When the winds got so bad, you had to hold on these giant boats that carry you across there. Listen, they were terrified. Is there anything wrong with being terrified? No, because it happens. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our makeup, the humanity of us. But you don't stay there. They weren't looking for Jesus. It's a ghost. Heaven's sakes, it went from bad to worse. That's what they thought. And they cried out fear. Next slide. God's help is always on time. Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Take courage, it is I. And then he said, don't be afraid. You know, there are 365 fear nots in the Bible. One for every day. One for every day. Fear not, fear not, fear not, fear not. Don't be afraid. So I say to you this morning, in this message of the winds that come through our life, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. God is on your side. Next slide. And so there he is going out toward the boat. They're scared to death. Next slide. God's purpose is always for our growth. Lord, don't you love that? Lord, if it's you. Is there any doubt in that? Lord, if it's you. Not, Lord, but Lord, if it's you. Love Peter. Don't you love Peter? Peter is one of those saints that everybody needs that has nothing to say but says it anyway. Right? He's the kid in the class that asked the question you were thinking. So we love the Peters of the world. And Peter said, tell me to come to you out on the water. Jesus didn't say, why don't y'all get out on the boat and y'all all try walking on the water? See if you can do it. No, he didn't try to test them that way. He just said, don't be afraid. I'm coming to you. And Peter goes, let me get out of the boat. Let me get out. Let me get out. Jesus, next slide. Look what Jesus says. Come. Okay, come on. Think you can do it? Come on, baby. So Peter gets out of the boat, and we all know this story. Move to the next slide. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked in the water, came toward Jesus, and when he saw the wind, so you know what he did? He was walking toward Jesus, then all of a sudden, you don't see the wind, you see the waves, which is the result of the wind. That's what we see is the result of the things that come. Not always good. And when he saw that, he began to sink. He began to sing, and he cried out, Lord, save me. Don't we all cry out for that? Save me. Save me. Next slide. And he reached out to Peter and grabbed him. I love this slide. I put this slide in mainly because it's such a beautiful painting of the boat in the background, but I love it mostly because it looks like Jesus is surfing. And that's my surfing Jesus picture. If you don't mind. Next slide. And immediately Jesus reached out his hand, caught him, which he does for us. He caught him and said, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? So he's teaching a lesson. Jesus is always teaching us a lesson. Do you ever get tired of that? Because we have lots of lessons to learn. Next slide. And God's help is always on time. We think, why didn't he answer my prayer? Why hadn't he done it now? I've asked him over and over again. I've had people come to my office and go, why didn't Jesus answer this? Because he has answered it for now. It's not going to be delivered in the way you think it should be delivered. There's more to learn, more to do. Next slide. And God's purpose is always for our growth. You see, I love football. I've been a season ticket holder for 35 years in college. Listen, you don't learn a whole lot from winning. You learn some. The coaches will tell you, when you win, everybody thinks you did everything right. But when you lose, especially those close games, the coaches tell you that those players listen to everything they have to say. You know when we learn is in the tougher times. We learn, we grow so much more. Everything Jesus is teaching us is for our growth. Next slide. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will direct your path. Next slide. He will always do this. These are ones you know. Another proverb, the verse before. Trust the Lord with all your heart and lean not to your own understanding. That's what this story is all about. Next slide. I must step out of the boat in faith if I intend to go to the next level, next spiritual level of faith. I always, churches are this way. We get a little scared about things, don't we? We got to stay within the budget. We got to stay within this thing, or somebody's yelling about something. Listen. If churches only do what you can do, you don't need the Holy Spirit. Do you hear that? If you can do only what you can do, you don't need the Holy Spirit. God wants to do great things in your life, in this church's life. And it's done often through difficult times like these in which we live. Because faith makes up the difference. And it's a time we have to exercise our faith rather than depending on just what I can do. Huge difference. Huge difference. Next slide. What boat do you need to step out of today? Where is the fear that needs to elevate you by faith to move into the next step of life? Next slide. And the next one. Here's the risk. I wrote these down. They're not complete. I just wrote them down kind of in a quick fashion. The risk of staying in the boat, unrealized potential, living a life controlled by fear, looking back and asking what could have been, not experiencing the thrill of success, not experiencing the comforting hand of a loving God as He reaches down and stops you from sinking and walks in the water with you. Jesus walks in the depths of our water with us. And He lifts us up. And He gets us ready. Next slide. Jesus is the Lord of creation, nature. Of course, He could walk on the water. It was not a surprise that He can calm the storm, and see Christ teaching us to walk by faith and trusting in Him may be the better miracle, the bigger one. Next slide. Life can be frightening and confusing. If you think it can't, just wait. If you've never experiencing dark nights or difficult long nights or difficult days, it means you just haven't lived long enough, because they come. And our reaction is not dread. It's the fact we have a challenge. And we have a challenge as churches in this pandemic and in all of the difficulties of life to answer that by growing in our faith and moving forward in the depths of the waters of life. Next slide. There is no danger of sinking when you are close to the everlasting arms. You're always close to Jesus. You know why? Because He's close to you. When I was a kid, I used to listen to Billy Graham, and Ethel Waters came to sing one night. And Ethel said, "If God seems 1,000,000 miles away, guess who moved?" And that had just an impact on my life, always remembering He's closer than I sometimes know that He is, or allow Him to be. He is with me. Next slide. For we live by faith, not by sight. Next slide. And then they had the epiphany. This is kind of the end of the story. This, if you're in a movie or a sitcom, whatever it is, there's always an epilogue at the end. Here's the epiphany. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down, and those who were in the boat worshiped Him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." All of a sudden, the politics went away. They got back in sync. We know who you are. We know you're going to take care of us. Next slide. And then He says, Jesus is the Lord of nature and creation. That He could calm the storm could not surprise us, nor it should surprise us that He can walk on His creation of water. The next slide. There's a wonderful story that many of you knew, this incredible Browning Ware, pastor, First Baptist Austin for many years, dear friend of Buckner Fanning's, and I got to meet him on many occasions. But when he was dying of cancer, he wrote this book, The Diary of a Modern Pilgrim. And this is what he said: "Our assignment, save the important things and let the rest go. The priorities read like this: save persons in preference to things, save relationships rather than face, save memories before money, and save eternity instead of time." It's kind of like getting in the boat and you realize God is God and the world is going to be okay. And so are you. Browning died not long after that book came out. But at the end of his life, when he realized what are the important things, that's what he wrote down. It's important. We remember that. I end with this story. Is there another? I think there's one more slide. Hold it right there. I end with this story, and I just thought of it this morning. But I want to tell you, is back when I was at First Baptist Cleveland with Charles over there, we started a specialty youth choir. It was a large ensemble group, really. I had auditions for it. Charles was in it. He was about to go to college. And right before he went, we took a tour of Texas. There were really some great voices in there, some that are singing to this day. And so we went around Texas. We went to Marble Falls, where I grew up, and we went around and sang at different places and came back to First Baptist Cleveland that Sunday night. We gave kind of the final concert. There was a guy in the youth group named Randy. Randy Smith was intellectually challenged. He was older than the rest of the kids. They adopted him. And I'm telling you, if anybody ever had a peer pastor, it was Randy with Charles. Charles just took care of him and helped him. And when he got loud and out of, Charles would calm him down. And the group just adopted him into the group. He was great. They allowed him to sack groceries at one of the little supermarkets there. But at the end of the concert on Sunday night, this is what happened. As we came back and sang, and I asked several of them between songs to give testimonies. Right before the concert, Charles had given Randy a Bible. He didn't have a Bible. So Charles presented him with a brand new Bible. It was about half the size of this one, if I remember. And Charles wanted to give his testimony. And that Sunday night, great crowd that night, Randy grabbed his Bible and he opened it up and he started quoting a scripture. And people on the front row began to say, "You have it upside down. You have it upside down." Charles moved from his side and turned the Bible right side up for Randy. There was a pause and a stress in the crowd. And all of a sudden, Randy said this. He said, "You all know that I cannot read a word of this, but you also need to know that I believe every word of it." There wasn't a dry in the house. Believe it. Believe it. So that when you get in those boats and the wind and the waves are against you, have faith. Believe every word of it.